apologize for such a long biographical sketch, but before I start in, I would like to at least acknowledge not only the funding that has come to me from the Humanities Center over the years, but even more important, all the encouragement that I've gotten from Walter and from the center. It's absolutely, it makes a difference, I think, a considerable difference, and so thank you very much. The other thing I want to do before I just launch into my topic is to say a few words about how I came to it, just because I think it's kind of interesting. I worked in on the Darwin Correspondence Project at Cambridge, and as a historian of genetics who worked more in the early 20th century, during my lunch hours, I used to go in the manuscripts room and look through the card catalog for other geneticists, and I was looking at William Bateson, who was a leading early British geneticist, and I kept finding references to women, and I thought, there weren't any women at Cambridge at this period. I mean, Cambridge didn't allow women to become formal students until after World War II. And the more I got into the topic, the more it became obvious that there were indeed women there. They were associated with two women's colleges at Cambridge, Girton and Newnham. And not only that, but they formed in the historiography, when people would talk about William Bateson's School of Genetics at Cambridge, which was so important in the early 1900s, they were predominantly women. So my interest was piqued, and here I am today, years later, working in the field. And I was fortunate enough to get a grant from the National Science Foundation, a major research grant from them earlier. And so they've given me a lot of money, or they did give me a lot of money to do background research in the women in genetics. And I'm currently working to write up this work. It's a long process. And part of the process, as you all know, when you're dealing with your own topics, is after you've done all of your research, how do you establish a framework for analyzing the data? And for history of science audiences, I usually take a completely different tack. I usually say, gee, genetics is an important discipline in the 20th century. It's a major discipline even today. And there were a number of Nobel Prize winners who were geneticists. And gee, look here, there were a number of women who worked in the field too. But what I primarily am doing is saying, well, to them, see, their work is important. They did work on this particular topic, and it was published, and it led to this result, and so on and so forth. And it occurred to me, and this actually came after moving to the history department and trying to think about my research in connection with how it fitted in with the niche that our Wayne State History Department has, which tends to be kind of labor-oriented, that one way that I could look at this that was apart from science and that august sphere of knowledge about the world that scientists and historians of science tend to think, somewhere disconnected up here, the Einsteins and the Darwins, the geniuses, right? And somehow you have to connect women up to that sphere. That another way that I could approach it would be to look at women's work in science and how some of these women that came in to the field can fit it into a more general notion of working class and middle class women who entered science after 1900. So that's the talk that I'm going to present today. I'd like to kind of frame it a little bit by giving some biographical detail about some of these women, and then I'll put them into the overall framework. At the earliest extreme, I have uncovered the work of Anne May Lutz, and unfortunately I only have an image of her that dates from the 1930s, and she died just a few years later, so it's the old Anne May Lutz, and it doesn't quite capture the vibrancy of her early working career, but she's pretty interesting for the kind of generation of women that I'm studying. Namely, she's one of the first to have access to women's higher education, and she obviously was talented. She was born in northwestern Indiana, and she was able to go to university just a few miles down the road in East Lafayette, West Lafayette, I guess, where Purdue University is. And she graduated with a degree in biology in only 3 years, so she's obviously bright. She stayed on at Purdue and did a master's degree, but that obviously wasn't enough for her. Because it's interesting, she came to the University of Michigan in 1893, I believe, 1892 or something, and Michigan had started a new program in biology that even though it was a Bachelor of Science, she basically took a second bachelor's through this program because it prepared people for students who wish to devote their time largely to biological work, either as preparation for the study of medicine or with a view to teaching or engaging in biological research. I mean, in the 1890s, this is pretty new for a woman to decide that she wanted to go into biological research as a career. So I began to follow her work to a degree, and you're going to see how she intersects with my study in just a second. In addition to Lutz, at one early period, I have a couple of other biographies. This is another picture of the person whose image I used to advertise the talk, Helen Redfield, later Schultz. And this picture comes from the yearbook of Rice University. She was a Texas farm girl, obviously, who must have been bright as well, and she entered the study of mathematics at Rice in the 1920s, but got very interested by the professor of genetics who was there at the time, Hermann Joseph Muller, who in the 1930s won a Nobel Prize for his work on mutations, the origin of mutation, and he's still a major geneticist today. And he encouraged her work. He encouraged her to go on, and indeed she went on and got a PhD in genetics at Berkeley, then got a National Research Council fellowship that enabled her to go and study at Columbia with the then leader in genetics, Thomas Hunt Morgan, who himself was a Nobel Prize winner in, I believe, 1932. But her career took a little bit different turn than Lutz's in that she married a fellow graduate student while she was at Morgan's lab, Jack Schultz, and the two of them formed one of these career partnerships in genetics, where she had a couple of children, but as you can see from her later biography, it didn't slow her down. She raised her children, but then continued to do research in genetics, basically up to the end of her life. So, she is also kind of, in a certain sense, similar to Barbara McClintock, who was born about the same year, just a couple of years later than Helen Redfield, and also very bright. She went to Cornell. She wanted to study animal breeding, plant breeding. She wasn't allowed to by the university, so she went into just a degree in botany. She had a little bit, she was single, and she was trying to make her way as a dedicated scientist, and she encountered a few hiccups along the road. Mainly, she got fellowships which allowed her to pursue her research. She got a teaching job at the University of Missouri, and something that I suspect they forever regret. They didn't give her tenure because she wasn't, it was very difficult for a woman to get tenured even at a coeducational university in the 1930s. So eventually she landed a position at Cold Spring Harbor, which I'm getting ready to talk about, and stayed there pretty much throughout her active career. But she won a Nobel Prize in 1983, and so is of sorts a poster child for women in the history of genetics. So I'm kind of framing my talk by saying, okay, how was it that these three women were able, willing and able to go into this field at this particular time, and how were they able to make a career in it? So just to give you a little bit of background information about the field of genetics, which you may not remember from high school at this point. You know, genetics, obviously heredity had been a topic in biology for a long period of time. Darwin himself had studied heredity, and after publishing Origin of Species, he made it his goal to come up with a theory of heredity, because after all, you need to, he posited his theory of evolution on the basis of all of this variation in the world and in plants and animal species. And the idea was, well, where did it come from and how was it passed from parent to child? So he came up with a hypothesis, but unfortunately for him, he was very excited about it, but no other biologists got terribly interested. So throughout the 19th century, the understanding of heredity was a black box area. Very little real advance came until Mendel's work was rediscovered in 1900, which, you know, that's another topic altogether. But basically, Mendel's theory of heredity gave scientists a new basis. And not just a theoretical basis, but even more important, an experimental basis. Because for the first time, they could perform experiments to try to get an understanding of what's going on in the germ cells that allow for heredity and variation to occur. So around the world, you know, this new program of Mendelism was established. And the person that I mentioned earlier that I started working on at my lunch hours at Cambridge, William Bateson, he established one of the first successful research programs in genetics, and my first publications in this area were on the women that he worked with. So I've begun kind of working now on the women in the United States that worked in the field, and I'm trying to put together kind of a framework for understanding them, because they're a little bit more interesting in a way, because it's, there were more opportunities here than there were in Britain. One of the first opportunities came by virtue of the largesse of Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, I never know exactly how to pronounce his name, who after 1895 began to give off his money and part of his huge endowment, and I think he also was trying to resurrect his reputation, which had been tarnished significantly, as we know, by some of his opposition to labor in the late 19th century. And one of the areas that he targeted for his funding was science, and particular areas of the life sciences, one of them being genetics. And interestingly, this guy, Charles Benedict Davenport, who had gotten his PhD at Harvard, but had been one of the faculty members that had been enticed to move to the University of Chicago, he put in an application for this funding. Interestingly enough, he was in competition with William Bateson, who likewise put in an application. Bateson was turned down, but eventually he got some funding in Britain and established an institute, and I'm working on his institute that started in 1910 in another part of my study, but I focused a lot on the institute for the station for, as Davenport called it the experimental evolution. And it opened at Cold Spring Harbor in 1904, and it became the first new private genetics research institution in the world. So Bateson came on in 1910 with one in Britain, and there was another one established in Berlin circa 1908 that later became funded by the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and became a leading German research institute. And interestingly, at all three, women formed the early, a large portion of the early staff. Now, part of that is because, despite the fact that I think Davenport got about $35,000 from the Carnegie Institution of Washington to set up his institute, most of it went into building the buildings at Cold Spring Harbor, and he had much smaller amount for the staff. And what he chose to do was to kind of go out and pick really young but promising research workers and hire them. So you can see, interestingly, George Shull, the botanist, and Frank Lutz, an entomologist, were both at Chicago. So they were young PhD types at Chicago, and Davenport just tapped them on the shoulder and said, "Why don't you come with me?" And they accepted. And then for the third research position, interestingly enough, Ann Lutz was selected. Why? Well, she had this, the credentials, and not only that, but in the time since graduating from Ann Arbor, she worked in the field of cytology. Now, interestingly, I could go off on that, but I don't really have any time, but cytology is, when you're sitting down at the microscope and you're looking at some of the cellular stuff. And just a little bit of background, part of the breeding research is, you're going out and you're doing the animal and plant breeding, but early on, people began to think, gee, these new chromosomes that were coming to the fore, do they have something to do with this Mendelian proportions that are shown, half female, half male, where are those numbers coming from? And it was about 1903 or so that scientists began to connect the chromosomes up with heredity. And so cytology came on. And so in many respects, Ann Lutz is in the vanguard in cytological research, and I've studied her scientific work, which she actually became fairly famous for her study. She was the first one to discover polyploidy, but I'll leave that for another talk. So she had a lot of background, not just educational, but she worked for 10 years in cytology at Columbia and at the University of Chicago. And I don't have a lot of information about her time at Chicago, but I believe that that's how Davenport got to know her. So how does this hook up with women at the time? Well, I want to kind of go through a little bit of what the situation of women were at after 1900 and how that augurs for them hooking up with genetics. Well, just to remind you, the first generation of women to have access to to higher education began coming in, and basically in the 1860s, late 1860s in the case of Girton College, Cambridge, early 1870s, Newnham College, Cambridge. But by 1900, there was a second generation of women who were graduating, and these were incredibly talented people, whereas therefore the pioneers in the field were pretty much happy just to get a degree of sorts and then pretty much return back home. The second generation wasn't quite so sanguine. They wanted to work, do work of a useful kind, as I got from one of my sources in the field of their study. So women are increasingly able to move into science after 1900. And this coincided with the more general women's movement of the time. And a lot of this quote came from a publication, came out in 1909, talking about the unrest of women. And it talked about, that, if a woman does not find a congenial mate early in life, she avails herself of the opportunities and finds much satisfaction in useful employment and pecuniary independence. So the people were kind of talking about this useful employment, and certainly you can look at Anne Lutz in that way. I mean, she could have gone home. She didn't need to work, but she really she had the ability, and she liked having her independence. The problem for middle-class women, and this is where I kind of intersect with some of the women, the labor historians' work, is there's a vast amount of literature on labor history, but it primarily looks at working-class women's entrance into the new, basically into the new industrial scene in late 19th century U.S. And the British Lydia Becker, and I like looking at her because she was a botanist, and she corresponded with Darwin on some of her botanical work, so she herself was a part of these talented women. She bemoaned the fact that the middle class was in an extreme disadvantage compared with either the working class or women of the upper classes. They just flat didn't have any kind of a niche. She says they're nobodies, and if they ask for themselves, they lose caste. And what she's referring to is the fact that if you were a middle-class woman, you weren't supposed to take any work. So that's why you find so many people in the progressive era, a lot of middle-class women doing unpaid work in political movements and conservation movement and so forth. They're working, they're engaged, but they're not being paid for it. One of the problems, however, was that at this time, there was a large group, increasingly growing group of women who could not rely on either their husbands or their fathers for support. This group being called redundant women. And if you're not familiar with that term, in Britain, if you're redundant, you're unemployed. Okay. So the redundant women basically are these women in the middle and upper classes who have to earn their own living. Many of them single women without any source of income available to them. And I just throw in for Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who's writing a few decades later, but she's also taking the similar kind of tack. We need to have more job openings for women. She's influenced a lot by Darwin's work. She kind of puts forward an evolutionary view about that it's a real loss to humanity if we don't make use of the talent of this other half of the human race. And so I particularly like bringing her into the mix too, because she does look at this. So just to remind us, this is the enrollment in institutions of higher education by sex, and you can see this is the male and the female, and this is the total. So both males and females were enrolling in universities, and so they were available in the job pool at this time. And this is the time that I am particularly looking at. So in short, there was a new workforce available in all kinds of areas for middle-class women, and but they were looking to break out. Previously, as you probably know, was only teaching. That most of these women, if they did get a job, they went into teaching. But teaching wasn't a terribly wonderful job for a lot of people, and they began to look elsewhere. A book that I've just recently discovered, and it kind of all kinds of lights went off when I read it, is Cindy Aaron's study of ladies and gentlemen in the civil service. And I did not know that in the United States the civil service became open to women from 1861. And it's a new opening for middle-class educated women to get in. And so she's done a very rich study because she made use of the National Archives. And she's got all of the applications that women made for positions in the civil service as she goes up to 1900. So it's very interesting profile of who the women are, what their backgrounds were before they came into there, why they needed the employment. And all of a sudden, it occurred to me that I could use this as a model for what I want to do, because nobody else has looked at this in the history of science in terms of women who are entering. And I also like the fact that she says that the civil service was the first large, sexually integrated, white-collar bureaucracy in America. So even besides the, we tend to think of women entering the industrial employment, but she's saying even before that. So in summary, there's a large pool of very talented and able and eager women available to enter into genetics at precisely the time that it's being founded. And so what happened to these women? Well, just to begin to look at some more specifics of the women who went into genetics. Women were not just products of the Midwestern coeducational universities as Lutz was, but many of them were also graduating from the leading women's colleges. And of those, the most important for biology were Mount Holyoke and Wellesley. They had a particularly strong science faculty. And it was Anne Haven Morgan, who was the zoology professor at Mount Holyoke, that fairly early on established a relationship with Davenport that became mutually beneficial for both of them, because she could place her students, and he in turn had this incredibly talented pool that he could draw on for workers. And it just shows you a little bit of this give and take of letters that I found between the two of them, where they're asking, are there any jobs opening for my students? Or, on the other hand, do you have any students that fit this bill? And this went on for a considerable time. And it's not just Davenport, but the men, because they were men who were heading up the individual departments at what eventually became the Department of Genetics at Cold Spring Harbor, but the botanist A.F. Blakesley and the very first animal zoologist C.B. Metz also established their own hiring networks for women. So for example, Metz wrote to Davenport, because Davenport had to approve all of these people, but he said, look, I found somebody also happened to be at Mount Holyoke, and she's wonderful, and I just want to remind you that these other very successful women who have been assistants to T.H. Morgan, the guy who eventually won the Nobel Prize at Columbia, and E.B. Wilson, who is Columbia's leading cytologist. So they, it's a good pool of people, and he recommends her the salary. I could talk about salary, but I'm going to leave that out of the talk just for purposes of time. But I will say that that's the similar, it's not just the genetics, and then I'm going to talk, there are a few other disciplines where women find a particularly attractive and amenable niche to go into, but medical research. The Rockefeller Institute opens up also another, wealthy industrialist who's trying to give off some of his millions. The Rockefeller Institute likewise opened in 1901. He decided to focus on medical research, and Rockefeller University and Institute, And the similar kind of pattern can be seen in the women who worked at the earlier at Rockefeller. And I loved this quote that I found from Julian Huxley, who was an Oxford zoologist who wrote a piece in 1935. And when he says, "My mind went back to a day in 1918 when I had been taken by a biological friend in New York to see the famous Rockefeller Institute. And at the word tissue culture, I saw again before me Dr. Alexis Carroll and troops of white-garbed American girls making cultures, sterilizing, microscopizing, incubating, and the rest of it." And I would love to find an image of some of these white-garbed American girls, but I need to actually ask the Rockefeller if they could give me one. I wasn't able to find one. So these women were there. They're coming into these new institutions. What are they doing? Well, most of them found jobs as either research assistants or research associates, and they came in as that, as opposed to an investigator, which most of the men who were associated with the institutes came in with. But I'd argue that some of them are technicians, but none of them, all of them are. And this is an argument that it goes back to historians of science. Basically, well, these are just merely technicians. They're not the people up in the ideas sphere. But that's not really true. If you look at all of these women, they all did rather remarkable work, and they published papers, single author papers, in addition to publishing with the respective heads of the division they're in, and an early picture of Barbara McClintock. So, they're a group of talented women. And increasingly in the 1920s, an interesting phenomenon took place. They began more and more women began to go back and get PhDs, or like Helen Redfield, they went ahead straight from undergraduate to a PhD. Primarily that was changes in academics, which we don't talk about very much, but before that time you could have a faculty position in an American university with a master's degree, bachelor's and master's degree. But increasingly from the 1920s, you're required a PhD. Interestingly, that was a problem for the women, because even though they went back and got their PhDs, they then had to compete with the men, and so many of them lost out. So many of their employment opportunities, kind of that you could even have a PhD and still have an employment status as a research assistant. So it didn't help them all that much. But just another indication, this cross-hatching are the master's degrees that women are getting. So you can see that just about as many women are getting masters as are getting bachelors, and increasingly they're getting PhDs during this time period. Many of the women at Cold Spring Harbor, where I'm really kind of focusing, are in this category, and Dorothy Bergner is an example. She came in 1921. She was only there for a few years, and then she decided she needed a PhD, so she did what a number did, that she went to Columbia and got her PhD there under Morgan, and then came back to Cold Spring Harbor and was appointed as the official cetologist, so kind of, again, taking Ann Lutz's position once again. And then she remained at Cold Spring Harbor up until Blakesley retired in 1942, and then she lost her job there, and that was when you officially had to retire at the age of 65. But she was fortunate because she basically was able to work in genetics up until she herself retired. So interesting. So, basically, what they were doing at Cold Spring Harbor, they worked on the research program of their particular director, but they published papers either jointly or independently of the respective director. They were definitely part of the normal science of the Institute, and they participated in laboratory life, and that, I don't have time to flesh that out, but that's one of the things, you know, this paper is kind of, I've decided to work this paper up into something that I can try ISIS, because I think it would be very interesting to kind of go in. We don't know very much about what was going on in these laboratories at the time in general. And I'm arguing that women make a really good way to get into the everyday material culture and organizational aspect of what's going on in these new experimental research institutes. And these women are definitely, you know, in the mainstream of scientific work at the time. And they became indispensable co-workers, and this is the slide that shows that they're not just doing, they're not just technicians. You know, in 1925, Metz wrote about one of his assistants and said, you know, she's capable of considerable independent work and is doing much of it with very little supervision from me. She was a particularly talented woman. So just to conclude, you know, there was a large workforce that was willing, able, and available. Just at the time that genetics came onto the field, and some of the women, they worked only a few years and they got married, just as the historians have shown was a pattern for women's labor in other fields, particularly working women, working class women did that. But interestingly, a number of these women went on and had full-time careers. They made a career out of science. Many of them remained single, and a number of them married and continued to work in science. And I'm looking at that phenomenon as well. And they made major contributions to the Institute, and I can look at the specifically at that by following the annual reports at Cold Spring Harbor to see what the individual women are doing, and not just their directors. You know, no one has, if you go to the historiography, the literature in working women, middle-class women, in any of the, I've kept looking at all of the books that are the leading areas in that, and in none of them could I find science as a sphere for these women, middle-class women to enter. So it's a new kind of area that general historians of women's work have not been looking at, but obviously it was important for the women's work more generally. And I would argue they weren't just there as craftspeople, and you can see that from the fact that somebody like Barbara McClintock eventually went on through this support and won a Nobel Prize for her effort. So just to kind of show you some images at the very end, this is a picture of what the Department of Genetics at Cold Spring Harbor looked like in 1934, and if you count the men and women, it's roughly equal, almost half. Many of the men that are the heads of the division are, you know, sitting in the middle with no doubt there are women assistants sitting in front of them, but there are a lot of other women in there, and you know, as I said, they are making contributions to the work. And it's not just America. I'm looking primarily at the United States now, but Richard Goldschmidt, whose work I've also trying to finish my book manuscript on, women were very much a part of his laboratory. And the case for the women in Germany that my co-author, Ida Stamhaus, is looking at, Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, makes a really good case study, because there is a position for women in the Institute. As the Germans would do it, it was an official kind of work where they got degrees almost, and they were licensed as an assistant. And interesting, if you look at the history of ecology, anybody is interested, no one to date has looked at women as being obviously just as prominent in the early history of ecology as were the men. And if I were early in my career, I definitely would go to Chicago, because there's a rich source of documents there about these women. And University of Chicago, we all know, allowed women. Columbia, University of Chicago were particularly welcoming to women. Same pattern for biochemistry. Women are very much represented in the early discipline, and the pattern holds true for radioactivity. It's not just Marie Curie in radioactivity. Interestingly, Curie did not really hire women, but women were very much present at the Research Institute in Vienna, made up at least half of them. And here's a photo that a friend sent me from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Brain Research at the time as well. So basically the pattern that we're seeing here is those areas in science that were interdisciplinary, where men weren't yet, the field wasn't yet terribly well tested, and so it wasn't a solid career path for a man to make his way in. Those areas tended to be particularly welcoming to women, and women were more than happy to jump into them and make their own career in them. So, thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer a question, or it would be great if you could give me any feedback as to other kind of ways to think about this project. Because sometimes, you know, you get, as I said to start out with, you get your data and you don't know exactly what to do with it.
This is a question, helpful feedback, but I'm curious, just what you were saying at the end about these fields being very open to women early. I would assume they then sort of become closed down to women. When did that start to happen, since these are fields that today are associated with men?
Yeah, it's interesting. For genetics, genetics had this trajectory. After Thomas Hunt Morgan comes on in 1910, Columbia becomes the place where you go and do genetics. And so the major field, you know, he revolutionizes, he establishes the chromosome theory of heredity by 1915. And so by 1920, genetics is on this trajectory that basically leads to today. It just shoots up. And most of the people who've studied the Morgan group, it's very masculine. You know, his guys, and they are, it's called the boss and the boys in the literature. But what I found is that the women are there. That's kind of why I put in Helen Redfield at the beginning, because she, if you, I've got a wonderful, I probably could have put that in, a wonderful picture of her, you know, from the 1920s when she's at Columbia, and there are as many women as there are men there, but they're usually the wives or girlfriends. But they continue to work in genetics. But as a research field where you can actually get a position at a university, but you know, most people assume that they're not there. But what I found particularly is a research strategy that I talked about in the last spring's Humanities Center's symposium was the married women. So T.H. Morgan married his former student from Bryn Mawr, and she's able to do research until the end of her life because her husband heads the lab, right? And Redfield hooks up with her husband, and I got one other, at least one other woman who's there. And what happens is that the husband may have the main job, but the women get a research appointment, often though not salaried. So it's caught up with a lot of other labor trends. for women's and the anti-nepotism that comes to the fore in the 30s after the Depression. Institutions can't hire the wives as well. So it's, but you're, so it shrinks, but it, people are still there, and it's kind of how they're still there that interests me.
Well, just an observation.
Yeah.
I noticed chronologically, because you were saying that one of the institutes that started like in 1904 with a large endowment, that women didn't start in that area until like 1910. And so I'm thinking about the chronological aspect of the history of women, you know, how far it goes back, and then when they actually come into the field, and just basically wondering what impact that they had on cures or, you know, breakthroughs.
Well, it's, you know, you'd have to, it's a good question. And some of the women that I've traced, it is so hard, it's like a needle in a haystack sometimes to follow these women. And so you kind of lose track of them a little bit. But I would say that there's a lot comes out of their work, but you just don't know about it generally, because even if they're working in a research lab, it's often the head of the department that it gets the credit for it. Even if they're publishing on the paper and have done the major research for the paper, they get kind of lost. And in the case of Bateson, there were, I know for a fact, that there were some concepts that came into genetics literature that was associated with his name that came from the woman, and he just happened to put it in his book, and so it became associated with his name as opposed to hers. So they're there, and what I'm, basically arguing is that we before this time, it's that it is the opening of these institutes, almost like the civil service, where it gives women the opportunity to make a lot of to do their work, and they are pretty much, they seem to be pretty happy just working, and they're not the firebrand feminists that want to go out. They just want to get on with it. They want to be able to do their work and to publish, and they do that, and they get on with life. And so it's they're there. We just don't know too much about them. So that's kind of what inspires me to do this work, is to try to say how they changed science in ways. And the history of science is still very much in the mold of intellectual history. It's those brilliant ideas that run science progress, and so they don't really. Very few people focus on those people in the lab that are fueling it.
But I still hear class struggle.
Pardon?
I still hear class struggle, that basically it's the middle class women who
I think the class comes into it by virtue of the fact that there are a few working class that are able to go and get higher education, but in order to have entry to these positions, you have to have education. So it's primarily the middle class, some upper class, who are able to get in, their foot in the door. So there's definitely class, but gender plays a huge role too in how far, the glass ceiling, and we could go into that. I mean, the glass ceiling for women in science is unfortunately still very much there, but I'm leaving that out. Yeah.
You mentioned genetics and biology at Columbia and
Yeah.
Chicago. Those places were also strong centers of anthropology and sociology. And in anthropology, you had, at Columbia, you had Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, especially
Exactly.
Benedict. There were students of Franz Boas and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Was there much of a connection between genetics and anthropology and sociology, at least at those two schools?
It's an excellent question, because I've looked, there's some wonderful scholarship on the women who graduated in social science, and particularly the students at Boas at Columbia. And so I've been able to draw on that. And and some people look at Morgan's relationship with Boas and Wilson, who are both, and they're allowing, women are taking their classes as well. And they had fairly close ties with Boas, but I don't have any specific information about the interconnection between the two, other than, you know, it's the diffusion. You know, I'm just basically assuming that the situation of welcoming for women in one area is also welcoming of sorts in another. Certainly, it's the case that Wilson accepted women in his laboratory and fostered them. Morgan did the same thing. So I know that Columbia was a particularly welcoming place for women, and the same thing at Chicago. Women were particularly well represented, not just in biology, but in mathematics as well as the social sciences. So it's a wonderful topic. Why areas? I would argue probably that in terms of disciplines, that anthropology is a fairly new discipline. I could put into the same category as I was doing ecology, that it's yet one more area that's welcoming to women at a time when they need people in the workforce. Yeah?
I have a question about, so your primary sources, were that you had a lot of letters in there. Were they letters from the institution, or were they from the individual people's personal things that they left behind, or how did you go about finding them?
Yeah, good question, because I went to Davenport's major papers, and a lot of the Cold Spring Harbor laboratory papers are at the American Philosophical Society Library. So I got a fellowship and was able to spend a month there and going through all of the papers. And when I was going through Davenport's paper, of course at the time I'm just looking for the stars. You know, I want the major women, the McClintocks and stuff. And then I kept reading these letters from like a high school student saying, gee, I'd really like to come and work at the lab, and a 40-year-old woman who said, gee, you know, are there any openings for me? And so I started transcribing those letters as well. He kept a lot of them. Unfortunately, not as many as Cindy Aaron had to draw on from the National Archives, but they're there. And it's out of those letters that I'm hoping to construct this paper that I'm doing out of this talk. They're there, and then some of the other letters are not just in Davenport's papers, but at the various women's colleges. So I've gone to Gouger and Mount Holyoke and Smith, and didn't go to Wellesley because there weren't too many of my biology people there. But anyway, you get at them that way, but it's really a hit or miss. And this is kind of for all of the historians, right? When you're going to do research, you may go with one particular idea in mind, but you get in there and you find something else. And I am really glad now that I took the time to transcribe those letters, because now it's turning out that I can make use of them. Even people who were not hired, it gives you their social backgrounds, their educational background often. And then the ones that were hired, I can kind of follow their careers, because mainly they were at Cold Spring Harbor for maybe 6 or 8 years at most, and then they go on, but I can usually follow them. And so that's kind of interesting. Even this morning when I was looking up some of her, Helen Redfield, I'm going to follow, I haven't looked at her in particular, I've got my research on her. I found, okay, 2 of her children are still alive, so I need to write to them, obviously, and sometimes I can do it that way. And I say, can you tell me about your mother? And I did that recently for the Spring Symposium at the Humanities Center. I did that for Lillian Morgan, Thomas Hunt Morgan's wife, and I had her daughter write back, who's really quite, actually it was her granddaughter, quite elderly now, in her 80s, and she gave me several pages of biography of what her grandmother was like. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, just even how to get at these women is kind of interesting. I Google a lot. And from time to time, new papers come online, and then I'm able to follow them. Because that's the thing, I don't even know when she died.